What about lectures? Here we are today simply painting the trajectory for the semester. But joining us as well, albeit virtually with these cameras in the room, are not only the Harvard Extension students who've been enrolled in the course for some time, but for the first time this year, will MBA students at HBS be allowed to take CS50 as an FAS course for credit. So literally at this moment, we have, well, in 10 seconds, the HBS students will see me waving my hand because they're seated in a lecture hall across the river taking now CS50, albeit from afar. Similarly, do we have students from Belmont High, Watertown High, taking the course for the first time so that they too can dive into a world that their own schools might not necessarily offer in the same form. And similarly, is this course available as what's called open courseware so that the entire world can indeed tune in, use the CS50 appliance, and learn at their own pace. So what's in store for the next several weeks? Well, this week in particular, we will introduce some of the basics. The ideas of programming and computer science itself. We'll focus in particular on a graphical language called Scratch, but more on that to come. Next week, we'll dive into a language called C. It's the C language that I implemented that silly little Hello World program just a moment ago. And even though it really might look like Greek to you now, you very quickly, trust me, will acclimate to this environment. And those common mistakes you'll make initially, not quite typing the right commands, will very quickly become old hat. In week 2, we transition to more domain-specific topics. Not so much low-level details, but how do we now use these skills to solve real-world problems? We'll talk about cryptography and encryption, the art of scrambling information so that things like your name and your social security number and credit cards are all entirely secure. The week after, we'll talk more about algorithms and these things called data structures. I actually intentionally picked an algorithm for counting students that doesn't require a huge amount of sophistication. Just requires a whole lot of brains, a whole lot of CPUs to execute it once, but it was still pretty simple. But when you get to the point of implementing Facebook or Google or any tool that's popular on your computer, you need typically to muster more intelligent resources for it, and we'll introduce you with those particular tool sets. In week 4, we continue this conversation and talk about things like memory management and how computers actually do what we command them to do. We'll talk in week 5 about another domain-specific area, forensics, the art of recovering or making sure you cannot recover sensitive information on your screen, whether it is some financial information or photos or documents or anything that you do or do not want to be recovered. In week 7, we introduce yet more sophisticated data structures so that you're equipped to solve even more sophisticated problems. In week 8, we transition away from C and to something more, let's say, modern, something more familiar, that of the web world. So by the end of the semester, will you be able to make certainly your own websites, but not just with HTML and CSS, the languages with which you just make static websites. We'll talk about PHP and SQL and JavaScript so that you can actually make things more dynamic. In week 9, we'll continue that conversation as well as in week 10, but it's really in the week's problem sets that you will dive in. In sections, we'll be this year particularly more hands-on. Sections are led by our team of some 40 teaching fellows, and there'll be any number of sections that won't start until week 3 of the course, but more on that next week. But realize there'll be a combination of conceptual coverage as well as hands-on activities with your own laptops. But the P-sets themselves are what make things quite memorable. On Friday, we look at this graphical language called Scratch. And you'll program for the very first time, I bet, quite intuitively by dragging puzzle pieces, little graphics that interlock only if it makes sense to do this and then that. And you'll be able to make, in just 2 days, your own graphics and games and interactive art in the context of this particular cat-based world. Next week, in problem set 1 last year, did students then transition to that language called C and implement the basics of programming, talking about things like loops and functions and jargon that will very quickly become familiar. But once we have just a couple weeks under our belt, can we start to play with things like cryptography? In problem set 2 last year, did students have to write their own cipher, an algorithm that encrypted and decrypted information so that you might indeed send a secret message to someone across the room. In problem set 3 last year, did students implement the game of 15, this otherwise silly party favor that you might have gotten where you move those numbers up, down, left, right, but in the context of a computer. And in that week in particular, for our more comfortable students, the Hacker Edition challenges you not to implement this in such a way that a human can play, but rather to implement the computer to play itself and solve this problem, no matter what the arrangement of the board is initially. In problem set 4 last year, did students implement Sudoku using a graphics library with which you could get colors and lines and more interesting user interfaces? In problem set 5 last year, did I stroll across campus and taking photos of people and places and things, and like a doofus, I accidentally formatted my digital camera's compact flash card, but never fear, I made a forensic image of my camera, whereby we then gave every one of those 494 students a file, inside of which were all of the bits, all of the zeros and ones that composed the JPEGs that I had taken of things on campus. We handed it out, and they wrote software with which to recover those photos. And for brownie points, once they had recovered those photos, they then went and recovered the people who'd been photographed. And we challenged students with a fabulous prize that if you photographed yourself with each of the faculty members who happened to be in the otherwise deleted photos, you would win some fabulous prize. So we had a couple of sections competing for that prize in the end. In problem set 6 last year, we implemented a spell checker, but a spell checker that was actually a bit competitive, whereby if you wanted, on an opt-in basis, you could challenge the so-called CS50 big board and run your code in such a way that we ran it through a whole bunch of tests and then reported on the course's homepage how much memory you were using and how many seconds your program took to load in 150,000 English words, to spell check the King James Bible, the Austin Powers movie script, and a whole bunch of other sample inputs. And what was fascinating about that particular piece set that year is that because of this optional competitive aspect, we never had people working so hard, because folks would go to dinner, they'd be number 2 on the big board or thereabouts, they'd come back and their roommate had been toiling away, now they've been bumped down to place 10, and so this sort of social aspect there enabled people, sort of incentivized people to go back to the drawing board to outdo their roommates. In problem set 7 last year, did we have students implement CS50 Finance, their own version of like an E-Trade-like website that's integrated with nearly real-time stock quote data with Yahoo Finance, so that you could buy and sell stocks and get nearly real-time stock quotes with your very own tool. Now, we also ran a simulated stock competition where we gave all 500 students 10,000 virtual dollars to play with. I did not implement that big board all that well, since a couple of our students who are now on staff crafted out of that 10,000 virtual dollars, I think 20 billion a week or two later. So there were some holes in the system. In particular, when you use something like Yahoo Finance, which you're not paying for, when I say nearly real time, I mean there's like a 5 or 15-minute delay. Problem with that, of course, is that you can see the future by just watching TV, seeing what the stock price is, and you still have 15 minutes to go buy the stock that's about to go up. So there are some real-world issues in at least our simulation there of fun. And in problem set 8 last year, did we challenge students to implement CS50 Shuttle, which integrated a website that students wrote with a plugin by Google called Google Earth, which allowed them to implement their own shuttle service, whereby you could open a web browser here. You could then go to your keyboard and start driving around campus like this. The goal being to pick up the TFs and CAs whose heads are looming large here in the distance, put them in your shuttle, and then bring them back to their particular house. So there's the Inn at Harvard. Let's see if we can make our way to the quad here. All right, there. Take a right here, left here, shortcut through the grass. All right, we're on Garden Street now. Registrar, and here we go, little shortcut to photo. And there we are at Fortheimer's house. And so that was a tool that our own students implemented last year for the climax of that year's problem sets. So what resources exist to empower you yourself to make sure you can succeed? No, too, in addition to sections and lectures, there are these things called walkthroughs, these optional sessions once a week that walk you through how to get started on a problem set, so that when you read these PDFs and stare at the screen and you have that very common question with any homework, my God, where do I begin? Well, these walkthroughs that are videotaped and led by the staff will walk you through the process of getting started. Like this. Takeaway today that 77% of the people around you have no prior experience, and you too can accomplish the sorts of things that you've seen on display here, so that your faces too will look a little something like this over the next several months But for now, cake awaits you outside. This is CS50, and we'll see you on Friday.